there is a rift that has been growing in the feminism movement for probably a few decades now between what are often called TERFs, which stands for trans exclusionary radical feminists, and the more modern, I'd say, feminists who are more accepting of transgender women, especially, that is, male to female transitioned individuals. I'm sure most people watching this are aware of this divide, they're aware of the distinction, even if they don't care about it. But because of this rift coming to more prominence in the last few years, and especially this year, it seems, I've actually found myself paying much more attention to feminists than I have for a while. Since I stopped identifying as a feminist, I sort of ignored the whole movement and all the discussions around it and never really took any of it seriously. I started paying attention to feminists more when they started being silenced, if that makes sense. When trans exclusionary feminists, or I don't know, some of them are called gender critical feminists, I think is that's the term they prefer. I don't know what the right way to describe these kinds of old school feminists is, but once they started to be silenced, once there was actually a cost to saying what they had to say, suddenly I was much more interested in seeing what they had to say, because especially with political speech, when you're making a point, if everybody is cheering you on for making that point, and if it's easy for you to say that, there's no cost that comes along with it, then I'm really not interested in listening to it. It's, as far as I'm concerned, like, it may well be true, whatever they're saying, they could have some good points, but somehow I just lose interest, because if someone's being cheered on and paying absolutely no cost for saying something, then it's kind of a heuristic I use for whether what they're saying is worth saying or not. These days, it's very common to see people who, put themselves up on a podium and grab the allegorical microphone, and they shout to anyone who will listen the most obvious, vapid statements that nobody could possibly disagree with. Things like, violence against women is bad. Racism is bad. Anything like this that's so easy to say that nobody could possibly disagree with you for saying. It's just not interesting to me. And any discussion around those points it just loses my interest. And that's what feminism was like for a while. But it was only when some feminists started to be silenced for saying that, biologically female women should have their own spaces to protect themselves from biologically male people. And I'm not saying I agree with the feminists who say that, but I just find myself more drawn to listening to them just because they've been they're actually paying a price for saying it, and so at least in their mind, whatever they're saying is so important that it's worth being punished for it. And that just immediately grabs my attention a little bit, and I think it's I don't know if that's wise or not. I mean, it is just a heuristic. It doesn't guarantee that this person has something worth saying, and likewise, just because something's easy to say doesn't mean it's not true or not interesting. But I started to wonder if that was the whole basis for YouTube channels. A few years ago we had this phenomenon of Dave Rubin became quite popular because he had this talk show where he brought on guests who usually were under attack from some group or another for something they'd said, and he would give these people a platform to talk about their ideas, and he'd ask them questions and try to start a conversation with them. And I think a lot of people have that same instinct that I'm describing myself, that same heuristic where somebody being silenced makes you a little bit more interested in hearing from them. More recently, I think this past year or so, there's the English equivalent of your Dave Rubin is the Trigonometry podcast, where these two comedians are doing something kind of similar, where they bring on people who have controversial opinions and talk to them about that. But it did start to get me thinking more seriously about feminism again, not as a philosophy that I was considering adopting or following, but just as intellectually looking at what is the future of feminism, what is going to happen, if the transgender activists, or should I say transgender allies, get their way and gender becomes a lot harder to define and a lot less about biology. Where is feminism's place in that? If any human who is born with female biology can opt out of being female, and similarly anyone born with male anatomy can opt into being female, I don't really know where that leaves feminism as a movement or as a philosophy. And I can see a scenario where feminism is driven underground and it does become dangerous again to call yourself a feminist and to proclaim rights for female anatomy people or to even talk meaningfully about male and female identities. I just wonder, what is the future of that? And it really doesn't seem like traditional feminism is going to win this battle. Which side is right or which side is wrong, I wouldn't like to comment, since I don't particularly like either of this sides of the political conversation. But I am just interested to see who will win, like what will become the prevailing correct opinion to have in the future. Who is history going to smile on when we look back at this time in the future? I think my main point is that if feminism as a concept gets driven underground and becomes uncool, I think it's possible that feminism might start to produce some good, useful ideas again, or if it ever did. I think the weight of public opinion is so heavy that it kind of prevents any meaningful discussion, any meaningful thought. If when you're worried about what people are going to think of what you're going to say, it shackles you. It shackles your mental faculties. You get boxed into what is acceptable, and prevent yourself from exploring outside of that. So if feminism stops worrying so much about what everyone thinks about them, maybe they're going to start producing something that's actually useful. And that could be the best thing that could happen to feminism, I think. So like I said, I'm interested. I'm watching that space. I'm paying attention to feminists, and I'm ready to see what they'll do next. And that's really all I've got to say for this video, but I'd like to do a video either before the end of the year or maybe in January, where I do a kind of year-in review of the news. And I know this channel has never really been a news, current events heavy kind of discussion, but I do try to keep an eye on what's going on. And for those of you who don't know, I don't know why you wouldn't, but I often go on the Unpopular Opinions streams with the Academic Agent and others, where we talk about the news of the week. And I think it's very interesting, especially this year, or maybe it happens every year, but there's so many stories that when you look back on them, it kind of shocks, well, for me anyway, it shocks me and reminds me, like, wow, that happened this year. Like, looking at things that happened, especially earlier in the year, that were so important at the time for like a few days, and then completely forgotten about, never brought up again. And I'd like to do a roundup of those kinds of news stories. So if you have anything that gave you that feeling, then please leave that in the comments, and I'll think about covering it. Any news stories that you were reminded, like, oh wow, that happened this year, like anything that surprised you when you remembered it. That's the feeling I'd like to generate in the viewer for this video that I'm talking about. Anyway, as always, please leave your comments in the comment section below and I will read all of them. If I don't see you before Christmas, which is very possible, have a very nice Christmas or whatever holiday you are celebrating this season, and I hope to see you again soon. What the hell is that sound? It does not sound like a plane. What was that?